Imagine you're standing in front of a massive, highly advanced supercomputer. It has just one single wire, and if you attach that wire to your head, you will instantly experience the absolute greatest life imaginable. Every pleasure, every dream just handed to you. The question is, would you do it? This isn't just some sci-fi movie plot. It's actually a famous thought experiment created by American philosopher Robert Nozick back in 1974, and it's called the experience machine. If you plug in, you wouldn't even know it's an illusion. You'd feel every joy, every triumph, literally every perfect moment. But here's the catch. Nozick argued that most people wouldn't actually plug in. Why? Because deep down, we want our lives to be real. We want to actually do things, not just simulate them. And that massive realization forces us to ask, if just experiencing pleasure isn't enough to make a good life, what is? Well, by the end of this explainer, you are going to understand the core philosophical theories of well-being, the mechanics behind them, and exactly how to apply these frameworks to evaluate your own life. Here is our agenda for today. 1. The meaning of well-being. 2. Hedonism. Is pleasure enough? 3. Satisfactionism. Getting what you want. 4. Objective goods, knowledge and virtue. 5. Eudaimonia, the flourishing life. And 6. Summary and final takeaway. Okay, let's jump right into section 1, the meaning of well-being. Before we can figure out how to get a good life, we have to define what well-being actually is. When philosophers talk about well-being, they aren't just talking about what's good in some grand abstract way. Well-being focuses on what is intrinsically good for a person. It's the state of living a truly flourishing life. So if you want to know if a choice or an action is valuable, you basically have to ask, does this promote my actual flourishing? So how do we measure that? How do we achieve this flourishing state? Well, historically, philosophers have tackled well-being through 3 main approaches. First, pleasure. Second, desire. And third, objective goods. Let's break these down one by one. Which brings us to section 2, hedonism. Is pleasure enough? Now, I see a common student mistake here all the time. When people hear hedonism, they immediately think of partying, eating a ton of rich food, and just indulging every bodily impulse. But philosophical hedonism is so much deeper than that. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who literally founded Epicureanism, did teach that pleasure is the highest good. But his version of pleasure, it was actually about living a life of moderation and virtue. He argued that wild, unchecked desires just lead to massive dissatisfaction. For Epicurus, true well-being meant achieving ataraxia, which is this profound state of tranquility and total freedom from mental and physical pain. Now, let's contrast Epicurus with a more modern approach you might have heard of, utilitarianism. Championed by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, this is also a hedonistic theory. But instead of focusing on just your own personal tranquility, utilitarianism treats pleasure and pain kind of like a mathematical formula for society. An action is considered moral if it maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain for the greatest number of people. It's essentially a system for maximizing collective well-being. But wait, this brings up a really important student-style question. When we talk about maximizing pleasure, are we just talking about a physical bodily sensation, or is pleasure actually a state of mind? Let's make this easier with a really simple example. Imagine biting into a crisp, juicy apple. Right away, there's a sensory feeling on your tongue. But truly savoring that apple isn't just raw data from your taste buds. It involves the cognitive belief that the taste is actually good. It satisfies a desire. This perfectly illustrates that pleasure involves our reasoning and our beliefs, not just raw physical sensation. And because pleasure is so deeply tied to our desires, it leads us right into our second major theory. Let's look at section 3, satisfactionism, getting what you want. If pleasure is a bit too subjective or just too hard to pin down, maybe well-being is simply about getting what you want out of life. This is the core concept of satisfactionism. The idea is that well-being is achieved by successfully satisfying your personal desires and preferences. Honestly, it sounds perfectly logical, right? Just get what you want and you'll be happy. But wait, there is a massive trap here. What if you're just wrong about what will make you happy? Imagine someone whose absolute deepest desire is to become an astronaut. They train their entire life, they finally make it to space, and then they realize they completely hate the extreme, crushing loneliness of spaceflight. If they had actually known what the job entailed, they never would have wanted it. This proves that blindly satisfying uninformed desires doesn't guarantee well-being at all. Only satisfying informed desires does. And this debate over what we desire forces philosophers to ask a pretty technical question. Do our values even express objective facts? Cognitivism argues yes, values involve thought and express properties, like saying this apple is healthy. But then you have emotivism, a branch of non-cognitivism championed by English philosopher A.J. Ayer. He argued that values just express subjective feelings. So when you say something is bad, you aren't stating a fact. You're literally just emoting. You're just expressing a negative feeling. And if emotivism is true, then well-being is completely subjective. Let's move to Section 4, Objective Goods, Knowledge, and Virtue. Because relying completely on our own desires or subjective feelings can clearly lead us into traps. A lot of philosophers argue we need something way more solid. Enter objective goods. These are things that are good for you, regardless of what your personal preferences are. Think about it like a balanced diet. Eating healthy is objectively good for you, right? Even if your absolute deepest desire is to sit on the couch and eat junk food all day, that preference doesn't change the objective fact that good nutrition equals better well-being. Aristotle actually focused heavily on this, breaking down 3 main objective goods. First, knowledge. We all have universal curiosity, and a lack of knowledge just leads to delusions. Second is virtue, which we'll dive into in a second. And third is friendship. Aristotle actually pointed out 3 types of friendships: those based on pleasure, those based on utility, and those based on character. And it's only that last one, friendships of character, where you genuinely want what is best for the other person, that truly endures and helps you flourish. Okay, let's look closer at virtue. In ancient Greek, the word is arete, which translates to excellence based on purpose. Let's use a quick real-life analogy. What is the purpose of a knife? To cut, right? Therefore, its arete, its excellence, or its virtue is its sharpness. A good knife is a sharp knife. For humans, virtue isn't just a nice personality trait. It's living excellently according to our human purpose. It's about finding what Aristotle called the golden mean, that perfect sweet spot between deficiency and excess. And that takes us to Section 5, Eudaimonia, the flourishing life. So now that we've explored pleasure, desire, and objective goods, we can actually pull all of these threads together into the ultimate goal of ancient philosophy, eudaimonia. Derived from the Greek words for good and spirit, people often just translate this as happiness. But honestly, that's kind of misleading. Eudaimonia is not a temporary high or a quick burst of joy. It is human flourishing. It's looking at your life as a whole and excelling in the things that are proper to human life. But bringing this ancient concept into our modern world is actually really tricky. Back in 1958, British philosopher G.E.M. Anscombe dropped a total bombshell on modern ethics. She pointed out that modern moral philosophies love to use the word ought. You ought to do this, or you ought to do that. But an ought implies a command, right? And a command requires a legislator, like a god. Anscombe argued that without that firm foundation, modern secular moral philosophy is standing on incredibly shaky ground. To fix this, modern philosophers have tried to build rigorous new frameworks for human flourishing. One is perfectionism. The thinker Spinoza argued that we should basically just pursue whatever increases and perfects our highest capacities. Then you have Immanuel Kant and his kingdom of ends. He imagined a hypothetical society where every single person is treated as an end in themselves, never just as a tool or a means to an end. It's a system designed so that absolutely everyone can flourish. Let's bring it all home with Section 6, Summary and Final Takeaway. We've covered a ton of ground today, from Nozick's experience machine to Aristotle's objective goods. So let's tie this all into one practical thought you can actually use. Contemporary Japanese psychology has this beautiful concept called Ikigai, which translates to your reason for being. It's not just basic hedonic happiness, it's an intuitive, deep sense of meaning you find by devoting yourself to goals that align with your true values. So, I'll leave you with this. If well-being is more than just a fleeting pleasure or a blind desire, what is your Ikigai? Think about what objective goods you can practice today to build a truly flourishing life. Keep exploring.